My name is Michal Moskow, and I'm Professor Emerita from Metropolitan State University, and I'm rostered also at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. It's called The Hungry Tide by Amitav Ghosh, who's an Indian writer. I think he lives in New York now. He's of Bengali background. His parents, I believe, went from Bangladesh during partition in maybe 1947 when India left. And then there was another big influx in the Liberation War when Bangladesh separated from Pakistan. And so he writes in English, very well educated. He himself was certainly not a poor refugee. He was able to get a good education in England and lives now in the U.S., I believe. And he deals so well, he intertwines issues of social class and caste in India and colonial domination and industrialization. Environmental issues are a big issue in this book and in others. And this includes plant, animals, people, and weather, what we're doing to the climate. And it's set in the Sundarbans, which are it's in the Bay of Bengal between Bangladesh and West Bengal in India, and it's got the biggest mangrove forest in the world, which is under threat now. And it deals with a woman named Pia, who is born to Indian parents, but in the United States and very American, and she's studying dolphins and looking for some dolphins that have been really hard to track. And so she goes there and then begins to be integrated into the community of people there, as well as doing her dolphin searching. So, among other things, there are quite a few stories woven into this, folk stories of people's experiences, and they're all woven into this because Amitav Ghosh is a writer. He's very poetic, and so we come up with stories. And there's a man who, before Pia went there, had gone out to explore. He was from the area, and he was taken to a place that he thought was Hindu. He says, I was amazed. I thought I was going to a Hindu puja. Imagine my astonishment on hearing these Arabic invocations. Yet the rhythm of the recitation was undoubtedly that of a puja. How often as a child had I heard those endless chants rolling on in temples as well as in our home. I listened. The language was not easy to follow. It was a strange variety of Bangla, deeply interpenetrated by Arabic and Persian. The narrative, however, was familiar to me. It was a story of how Dukhi was left on the shore of an island to be devoured by the tiger demon Dokhin Rai, and of his rescue by Bombibi, a good goddess, and Shah Jangoli. At the end, after the others had said their prayers, we picked up our things and made our way back across the clearing to the shore. When we were back on the boat, heading down toward an island they were going to, I said, "Where did you learn that long recitation?" He looked startled. Why, he said, I've known it as long as I can remember. I heard my father reciting it, and I learned from him. So is this legend passed on from mouth to mouth and held only in memory? Why, no, he said. There's a book in which it was printed. I have a copy. He reached down into that part of his boat where he stored his things and pulled out a tattered old pamphlet. Here, he said, have a look. This was a very, very old book. It struck me that this legend had perhaps taken shape in the late 19th or early 20th century, just as new waves of settlers were moving into the Tide country. And was it possible that this accounted for the way it was formed from elements of legend and scripture from the near and the far Bangla and Arabic? How could it be otherwise? For this I have seen confirmed many times, that the mud banks of the Tide country are shaped not only by rivers of silt, but also by rivers of language, Bengali, English, Arabic, Hindi, Arkanese, and who knows what else. Flowing into one another, they create a proliferation of small worlds that hang suspended in the flow. And so it dawned on me. The Tide Country's faith is something like one of its great mohanas, a meeting not of just many rivers, but a roundabout people who can use to pass in many directions, from country to country and even between faiths and religions. So we see the interplay of different cultures, different people that are important throughout Amitav Ghosh's works. And then to continue with this story, there were refugees coming from part of India and headed toward this island because they had to have some place to live. And this becomes very, very well connected with what's going on our borders right now. And he heard the government is going to take measures, very strong measures. I said nothing, but began to wonder if there was any way I could get word to warn the settlers. As it turned out, no warning was possible. The very next day, the government announced that all movement in and out of the island was banned under the provisions of the Forest Preservation Act. What was more, Section 144, the law used to quell civil disturbances, was imposed on the whole area. This meant it was a criminal offense for 5 people or more to gather in one place. And remember that India, of course, was ruled by Britain. As the day wore on, waves of rumors came sweeping down our rivers. It was said that dozens of police boats had encircled the island. Tear gas and rubber bullets had been used. The settlers had been forcibly prevented from bringing rice or water to the island. Boats had been sunk. People had been killed. The rumors grew more and more disturbing as the day passed. It was as if war had broken out in the quiet recesses of the Tide Country. I could not sleep that night, and by the time morning came, I knew I would make my way to the island in whatever way I could. Early in the morning, a group of schoolmasters came to see me. They had heard the same rumors I had, and they too had become concerned, so much so that they had hired a bote to take them to the island to see if any intercession was possible. They asked if I wanted to join them, and I was only too glad to say yes. We left at about 10 in the morning and were in view of our destination within a couple of hours. I should say here that the island is a large one of the biggest in the Tide Country. Its coastline is probably a dozen miles long. When we were within sight of the island, but still a good mile or two away, we saw clouds of smoke rising above it. Soon we drew close to a village. A great number of people had gathered on the shore, and they were busily loading a boat, not a bote, the small boats, or a sail boat, but a plain country noka of the kind Horan, his pilot, owned. Even from a distance, we could see that the boat was being stocked with a cargo of supplies, grain, drinking water. Then a number of people climbed into the boat, mainly men, but also a few women and children. Some, no doubt, were day laborers who'd gone to work on some other island and been unable to return home. And as they go on, he's thinking about all the people who were separated from their families and trying to get back. Whatever their reasons for going, clearly they were pressing enough to make them take the risk of cramming themselves into that frail craft. By the time the boat was pushed into the water, there must have been a good 24 people sitting huddled inside. The boat wobbled as it drifted out into the currents. It was so heavily loaded that it seemed incredible that it would actually stay afloat. Watching from a distance, we speculated excitedly. These settlers were evidently hoping to slip through the police cordon with some provisions to bring relief to their fellow Icelanders. What would the police do? Everyone offered a different theory. And then they heard a very loud cry. How strange it was to hear this plaintive cry wafting across the water. It seemed at that moment not to be a shout of defiance, but rather a question being addressed to the very heavens, not just for themselves, but on behalf of a bewildered humankind. Who indeed are we? Where do we belong? And as I listened to the sound of those syllables, it was as if I were hearing the deepest uncertainties, my heart being spoken to the rivers and the tides. Who was I? Where did I belong? In Calcutta or in the Tide Country? In India or across the border? In prose or in poetry? And he does link art and poetry to political and social situations, as does Toni Morrison, my other favorite. And so they continue toward the island. And the siege went on for many days, and we were powerless to affect the outcome. All we heard were rumors that despite careful rationing, food had run out and the settlers had been reduced to eating grass. The police had destroyed the tube wells, and there was no potable water left. The settlers were drinking from puddles and ponds, and an epidemic of cholera had broken out. The river that came through, the waters, as did the people and the languages, the waters merged salt water and fresh water together. One of the settlers managed to get through the police cordon by swimming across the Garal River, an amazing feat in its own right. But not content with that, the young man had somehow made his way to Calcutta, where he talked at length to the newspapers. A furor erupted. Citizens groups filed petitions. Questions were asked in the legislature, and finally the High Court ruled that barricading the settlers was illegal. The siege would have to be lifted. The settlers, it seemed, had won a notable victory. The day after the news reached us, I saw Horan waiting near their boat, and they went down and left, and they felt very optimistic, but the police weren't gone, and they were ordering people to leave their homes. And as we go on, there are dangers in the mangrove forest. It's the water, which comes in and goes out, and they can have floods that are very bad. We hear about those in Bangladesh still. And animals, there are tigers and crocodiles, both of which kill people. And so you have to be very careful. Somewhere in the book it says not just of the animals. And so Pia, the woman who's studying the dolphins, and her translator were picking their way through the mangroves when they were waved to a stop. The guide took the flashlight out of the translator's hand and shone it down at his feet. Going over to join him, Kanai and Pia saw that the beam had settled on a mark in the ground. The earth here was neither dry nor wet, but pliable like clay, and it had preserved a stencil-like impression. Neither Kanai nor Pia had any doubt of what it was. The prints were as clearly marked as those of a kitten daubed on a kitchen floor, only many times larger. And they could see that these were the prints of the tiger. And eventually, the tiger, who has killed animals and people, is killed by the villagers in a way that seems quite cruel to Pia. But then she's a Westerner and an environmentalist. And there are obviously conflicts between the environmentalists and the settlers. And her guide, as she stays on looking for the dolphins, which are very hard to find, she meets up with a man named Fokir who knows that he's a boater, he has a boat, and he knows where the dolphins are. He's illiterate. But sitting behind her on the boat when they're out looking, had his fingers knotted around her stomach. A storm is coming, a cyclone. And so he got them to land, and they climbed a tree to be above the water. And he gets behind her to protect her. The noise of the storm deepened, and another roar made itself heard over the rumbling din of the gale, a noise like that of a cascading waterfall. Stealing a glance through her fingers, Pia glimpsed something that looked like a wall hurtling toward them from downriver. It was as if a city block had begun to move. The river was like pavement lying at its feet, while its crest reared high above, dwarfing the tallest trees. It was a tidal wave sweeping in from the sea. Everything in its path disappeared as it came thundering toward them. Pia's mind went blank as disbelief yielded to recognition. Up to this point, there had been no time for terror, no time to absorb the reality of the storm and to think about anything other than staying alive. But now it was as if death had announced its approach, and there was nothing to do but wait for its arrival. Her fingers went numb in fear, and she would have lost her hold on the tree if Volker hadn't taken her hands in his own and held them fast against the trunk. Pia felt his chest expand as he gulped in a deep draught of air, and she did the same, swallowing as deep a breath as she could manage. And then it was as if a dam had broken over their heads. The weight of the rushing water bent the tree trunk almost double. Encircled in Volker's arms, Pia felt herself being tipped over and then upended as the branch met the ground. All the while, the water raged around them, circling furiously, pulling at their bodies as if it were trying to dismember them. The tree strained at its roots, and it seemed that at any moment it would be torn from the earth and added to the storm of turbulence following the wave. And the storm, hence the title, of course, the Hungry Tide, but the Hungry Tide refers to more than just the water itself. In the end of the cyclone, unfortunately, Volker remains so dedicated to her that he has surrounded her on the tree with his own body, and a tree that had been uprooted was slammed into him and killed him, but not her. And she then begins to feel responsible, and she's gotten to know his wife and some other people who started a foundation, a hospital, and a school. And so she went back to Calcutta. She said she would always return. They didn't believe her because tourists came all the time and said, I'm going to come back, and they never did. But she does show up again, and they're surprised. And she said, they ask her why. She said, I sent out some letters explaining what happened during the cyclone and how Volker had died. Some of my friends and colleagues took up the calls and circulated a chain letter to raise money for his wife and son. The response was better than we'd expected. The money's not as much as I'd have liked, but it's something. It'll buy them a house of their own and maybe even provide a college education for Tutul. Oh, said Nilima, sitting up. I'm glad to hear that, very glad indeed. I'm sure his wife will be too. But that's not all, said Pia. Really? Nilima raised her eyebrows. What else have you been up to? I wrote up a report, said Pia, on my dolphin sightings in this area. It was very impressionistic, of course, since I'd lost all my data in the cyclone, but it sparked a lot of interest. I've had several offers of funding from conservation and environmental groups, but I didn't want to go ahead without talking to you first. Me? Cried Nilima. What do I know about such matters? You know a lot about the people who live here, Pia said, and for myself, I don't want to do the kind of work that places the burden of conservation on those who can least afford it. If I was to take on a project here, I'd want it to be under the sponsorship of the Badabon Trust, which had been set up already there, so by the local people. So the local fishermen would be involved, and the trust would benefit too. We'd share the funding. So in a way, it's almost a letdown of an ending because she becomes so good. And she is going to do what we know and what we tell politicians all the time. You can't just go in and decide for other people. You really need to include the needs and the desires and the knowledge of the people you're working with. And so what I'd like to say in closing, I didn't read any of the sections about the dolphins, which are also quite moving, but there's a time limit, I guess. But I strongly recommend that people read this book and then follow it with his next novel called Gun Island. Has some of the same characters in it, and it deals even more heavily with global migration, as a couple of young men from this book decide to try to make their way to Europe illegally across land and then across water, and there is, of course, a boat that turns over, and so it's quite unclear for a long time whether they made it or not. But you also see the class difference in people who can go. They were headed toward Venice, and Pia was going there. She had a former professor who was there, and another man was going there. None of them wealthy, but, you know, I'm not wealthy, but I've been in a lot of countries. But I went in legally, and I came out legally, and that's what the refugees are not able to do today, and it gets worse and worse. So I really strongly recommend you read books by Amitav Ghosh if you haven't, and there are others, but I think these two hit in a low-keyed way. It doesn't hit you in the face, except for the very ending where Pia decides that she's going to involve the local people. It doesn't hit you in the face, and that's what I think is poetic about this book, as I do Toni Morrison's book, especially The Bluest Eye. It's poetic prose with a strong social message, which is why it was banned. Thank you.